Stephen, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your tech background, and what do you do now?
Okay, so I work at Microsoft. I work in the Azure office of the CTO in what's called the open source ecosystem team. So we're an outward facing group of folks. We work with our partners, often through the nonprofits where we're collaborating around those kind of supporting structures that support the open source projects that we care about that we're building into, customer facing product and infrastructure and such. Uh, I've been around this space for better part of 35 years, since long before we called it open source. And I think I was lucky that I got involved in the Unix standardization efforts back in the late 80s. And when you started going to conferences like USENIX, you were surrounded by this huge collection of folks, vendors, researchers from places like UC Berkeley, their computer science research group, or Bell Labs. And the idea that you'd be collaborating on a piece of software was just the way we got things done. Yeah, that point, X11 was on the rise. Well, X11 came out of an open source licensed collaboration between IBM, HP, and DEC. And it was like this period of history. We didn't call it open source yet. We in 1980, United States Congress slapped copyright law on software. So we were in this kind of exciting experimentation of using licenses to continue to collaborate in ways that we'd always collaborated. So the idea that you have researchers and companies collaborating on open source licensed projects together was normal. And I was really lucky that through that influence and through the standards work and the collaboration that happens with engineers in that kind of environment, uh, I ended up in a startup mid 90s. And what we were building was the Unix interface on Windows NT, this kind of brand new Microsoft operating system. And we started with, 4.4 BSD Lite because that was the distribution that AT&T's lawyers said the world could use. We were already into lawyers suing people around free, liberally licensed software. And so it was just this really interesting time. And so for 4 years, we were collecting together large projects of software. There was on the order, 250, 300 buckets of interesting technology covered by 25 to 30 licenses, some of which still aren't OSI approved, that we then, shape and assemble and evolve, because not all of them were standards conforming, into a standards conformant Unix interface that would build and run on Windows NT on three different architectures and provide you that kind of perfect fidelity of a Unix machine. So we weren't trying to emulate things. We had I guess that was the extra complication in this startup is we had a license for the Windows NT source from Microsoft, which was a fairly unique thing at that point in history. And so juggling all of these licenses, all of these collections of software, some of which, extremely proprietary, like the Microsoft license, like our company existed because of our protection of that license and the proprietary nature of it was normal to us and normal to run the complexity of the build trees across the multiple architectures. It was normal for us to contribute back to the projects with any major changes that we made. One of the biggest, changes we had to make, we needed control, just like every company, sooner or later, you need control of your compiler chain. And so we ended up in that space where every engineer understands build versus buy, and we couldn't pivot my startup team to build a compiler. And we certainly weren't going to buy three compilers for three architectures. So we used GCC because that was this fantastic base of code at the time. And I hired an HP compiler engineer with 20 years of experience in systems and compilers. And over the rest of that year, they built out GCC in our world. So I know exactly how to think about this idea that, okay, instead of build versus buy, we're doing this borrow and share thing with an open source licensed body of code. I know exactly how much his salary cost and what that meant for us in terms of the gain back. You know, at the time, GCC was 750,000 lines of code. And you know, we all hate lines of code measurements in our industry, but they're interesting relative measures. And so like that was just the experience from 95 to 99 of building this rich customer facing product out of all of these liberally licensed projects and contributing back where we needed to and knowing exactly what that engineering cost looked like as a company. And that so I kind of carried that into we did not make it as a company, but we were an asset acquisition back into Microsoft in 99. And so that was that period where Microsoft didn't really talk about Linux in those days. And open source was a very confusing thing. This is like 2 years after the first Halloween document, for those that remember the Halloween document. And so it's just been a really interesting 25 years since then. But that was the everything that led into this. And so, you know, I worked at Microsoft for 5 years in that period and got to see software delivery and deployment at extreme scales compared to most other companies. Um, I've since then I've consulted, I've worked for an open source nonprofit. I had the pleasure and privilege of working at Hewlett Packard during the OpenStack period in Helium and got the exciting education of watching that shut down within HP. And you know, continue. I ended up back at Microsoft again almost 7 years ago. So it's been a checkered career, but I've had a lot of fun around. Everything's always tied back to this idea of engineers collaborating, liberally licensed software, building products for customers. So it's that's kind of the big sway, you know, kind of big sweep of my career over the last 35 years.